It was a bitter November night in London, when the fog lay thick upon Baker Street, and the gas lamps burned like pale moons behind the yellow gloom. I had not seen Holmes so restless in weeks, pacing before the fire with his violin untouched upon the table. Then, at precisely 11 minutes past midnight, a telegram arrived. Its sender was a man who had been dead for 3 days. Holmes read the message once, then handed it to me. "Watson, I am dead. They will come for the second telegram before dawn." Within minutes, we were racing through the sleeping streets toward the Thames. Scotland Yard believed it a cruel hoax. Holmes knew better. For somewhere in London, a murderer was waiting for a message from a dead man, and Holmes intended to answer it first. Chapter 1. A case presents itself. It was a bitter November night in London, one of those evenings when the fog seemed less a weather condition than a living thing that had crawled in from the Thames and wrapped its cold fingers around the city. The gas lamps of Baker Street burned as blurred yellow halos, while the occasional hansom cab emerged from the darkness with the muffled clatter of wheels upon wet stones. I had been reading beside the fire at 221B when I noticed that Holmes had not touched his violin for nearly an hour. Instead, he stood before the window, one hand behind his back, watching the fog. "You are expecting someone," I remarked. "No," said Holmes. "I am expecting something." Before I could inquire further, 3 sharp knocks sounded upon our door. Mrs. Hudson appeared a moment later with a telegram in her hand. "This has just arrived for you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes took it without expression. He tore open the envelope, glanced at the message, and then became perfectly still. I had seen many strange things during my association with Sherlock Holmes, but there was something in his silence that chilled me more effectively than the November air. "What is it?" I asked. He handed me the telegram. The message contained only 2 sentences. "Watson, I am dead. They will come for the second telegram before dawn." I looked at Holmes. "Who sent it?" "That," he replied quietly, "is precisely the difficulty." He turned the paper over and examined the reverse beneath the gaslight. "The sender's name is Edward Bellamy." I confess the name meant nothing to me. Should it? To the police, perhaps. To us, most certainly. Holmes crossed to the mantelpiece and consulted a small notebook. His long fingers moved rapidly through several pages before stopping. "Edward Bellamy," he murmured, "engineer, 38 years of age, formerly attached to the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich, resigned 6 months ago, subsequently became involved in the development of a new method of long-distance telegraphic transmission. And he is dead!" Holmes looked at me. "He was pronounced dead 3 days ago." The fire gave a sudden crack. Outside, a cab rattled past and disappeared into the fog. I stared again at the telegram. The paper was ordinary enough, slightly damp at one corner, with the familiar blue lines of the telegraph form. Yet those few words seemed to possess a weight far beyond their size. "Then someone has sent it in his name." "Undoubtedly." "A practical joke?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps. But practical jokes rarely announce the arrival of a second telegram before dawn." At that moment, the bell rang again. Holmes and I exchanged glances. Mrs. Hudson admitted a tall, nervous gentleman wearing a dark travelling coat. His face was pale, and droplets of fog clung to the brim of his hat. He carried a leather dispatch case beneath one arm and kept glancing toward the hallway as though he feared someone had followed him. "Mr. Holmes?" "Yes. My name is Arthur Pembroke. I was a colleague of Edward Bellamy." Holmes motioned him toward the chair. "You have received the telegram." Pembroke stared. "How could you know that? You came here immediately after hearing of it. You are frightened." "You have brought a dispatch case containing something you believe Bellamy intended me to see." Pembroke slowly placed the case upon the table. I confess I noticed nothing unusual about the man's boots, his coat, or the trembling of his hands. Holmes, however, appeared to have read a history from them. Pembroke opened the case. Inside lay several folded documents, a brass instrument of complicated construction, and a small black envelope sealed with red wax. "Bellamy gave me these 2 days before he died," he said. "He told me that if anything happened to him, I was to bring them to you. And yet you waited 3 days. I was afraid." "Of Bellamy?" "No." Pembroke looked toward the window. "Of the men who killed him." The room seemed suddenly colder. Holmes leaned forward. "Tell me everything." Pembroke swallowed. Bellamy believed someone was stealing his work. He had developed a device capable of transmitting a message through ordinary telegraph wires without the receiving station being able to detect the additional signal. Holmes's expression sharpened. An invisible communication channel. "Yes. And what was the purpose? I don't know." "Bellamy believed it was being used to exchange information between London and the continent." "By whom?" "That is what he was trying to discover." Holmes opened the black envelope. Inside was a single strip of paper bearing a sequence of numbers. He studied it for several seconds. Then he smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "Mr. Pembroke," he said, "your friend did not merely discover that his invention was being stolen. He discovered who was using it." A sudden sound came from the street below. A whistle. 3 short notes. Pembroke went white. "That is the signal." Holmes extinguished the lamp. For several seconds we remained in darkness, listening. The fog pressed against the windows. Somewhere below, a horse stamped upon the pavement. A distant church clock began to strike midnight. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs. Slow, measured, approaching our door. Holmes whispered, "Watson, stay behind me." The footsteps stopped outside. No knock came. Instead, a folded piece of paper slid beneath the door. Holmes picked it up. He read it beneath the faint glow of the dying fire. Then he handed it to me. It contained only 6 words. "The second telegram has been sent." I looked at Holmes. He was already reaching for his revolver. What happened next, I could scarcely have imagined. For before dawn, we would stand beside the Thames, facing a mystery in which the dead appeared to communicate with the living, and a murderer had made certain that his victim's final message would never reach Scotland Yard. Chapter 2. Into London's streets. The footsteps outside our door remained silent for several seconds, and then began their descent. Holmes waited until the sound had vanished before he opened the door. The corridor was empty. Only the damp scent of fog and coal smoke remained, mingling with the warm tobacco smell of our sitting room. Holmes bent down and examined the paper once more. "Interesting." "What is interesting?" "The ink. I confess I could see nothing remarkable about it." Holmes held the message close to the lamp. "The writing is fresh, Watson, but the paper is not. It has been folded for some time." "You mean the message was prepared in advance?" "Precisely." He slipped it into his pocket. "Come, we have 3 places to visit before the night is over." Our first journey took us toward Woolwich. The streets were almost deserted, save for policemen beneath gas lamps, late-night workers returning home, and the occasional carriage sending muddy water across the pavement. The cold entered through the seams of my coat, while the air tasted faintly of soot and iron. At the arsenal, we found the night watchman, Samuel Price, waiting beside a furnace room. His boots were coated with reddish mud. "Bellamy worked here?" Holmes asked. "For 7 years, and he left voluntarily." Price hesitated. "That is what they said." "What do you say?" The old watchman rubbed his hands together. "I say Mr. Bellamy was frightened during his last week, kept looking over his shoulder, came here twice after resigning." "Alone?" "The first time. The second time he was with a gentleman." "Describe him." "Tall, grey overcoat, silver-headed cane." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Did Bellamy give him anything I saw a packet change hands. What sort of packet? Small. Brown paper. Holmes thanked him and led me away. I had assumed the packet contained Bellamy's invention, but Holmes disagreed. Not the invention, he said. How can you know? Because Price remembered the wrapping but not the object. If it had contained something mechanical, he would have mentioned its weight or shape. A paper packet suggests documents. The significance escaped me entirely at the time. From Woolwich, we travelled to a small telegraph office near the river. There Holmes questioned the night clerk, a young man named Lewis Carter. You handled a telegram from Edward Bellamy? Carter nodded. Yes, sir. Received shortly after 11. Was it sent from here? No. The message came through the central office. Did you notice anything unusual? Carter frowned. The transmission was delayed. How long? Nearly 4 minutes. Holmes leaned against the counter. 4 minutes? Yes. And then? The machine printed normally. Holmes examined the telegraph apparatus. May I? Carter stepped aside. Holmes inspected the brass contacts, the paper strip, and the ink roller. The machinery smelled of oil and hot metal, and every few seconds a faint ticking came from the mechanism. Finally, he pointed to a tiny scratch on the brass casing. This has been opened recently. Carter looked astonished. We service it every Friday. And today? Thursday. Holmes smiled faintly. Then someone serviced it a day early. We left the office shortly afterward. As we crossed the street, Holmes stopped. Watson. Yes? Look across the road. A man stood beneath an awning. Grey overcoat, silver-headed cane. He saw us looking at him and immediately turned away. Holmes started after him. The chase carried us through narrow lanes toward the river. Horses clattered behind us. Dock workers shouted, and somewhere a ship's whistle sounded through the fog. We rounded a corner. The man was gone. Holmes examined the pavement. His left heel is damaged. How can you tell? The impression is deeper on the outside. He straightened. He walks with a slight limp. We hurried toward the Thames. At the dockside, the fog was thicker. The smell of tar, wet rope, fish, and coal smoke hung over the water. Barges groaned against their moorings, chains rattled, and somewhere in the darkness, a sailor cursed loudly. Holmes approached a boatman named Jacob Reed. Did a gentleman with a grey coat come this way? Reed shook his head. Plenty of gentlemen. One with a silver-headed cane. The boatman paused. Ah, that fellow. When? 10 minutes ago. Where did he go? Warehouse 12. Holmes looked toward the dark building. I confess that by then I had begun to understand why Bellamy's final telegram had frightened Pembroke. There were too many people involved, too many unexplained movements, and too many pieces of evidence pointing in different directions. Holmes seemed less troubled than ever. Consider the facts as we knew them, he said quietly. A dead engineer sends a telegram. A second message follows. Someone has tampered with a telegraph machine, and a man connected with Bellamy's work is watching us. And you believe they are connected? I do. Then why lead us directly toward them? Holmes gave me one of his brief smiles. Because, Watson, criminals are often most informative when they believe they are following us. We entered the warehouse. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. The wooden floor was damp beneath our boots, and the air carried the bitter smells of rope, salt water, and machine oil. A lantern burned at the far end. Beside it stood a small wooden crate. Holmes approached cautiously. The lid had been removed. Inside was nothing except a telegraph key and a folded sheet of paper. Holmes opened it. His face changed. What is it? I asked. He passed it to me. There was a single sentence. Bellamy was not the first. Before I could speak, a crash came from the far side of the warehouse. Holmes seized my arm. Down! A bullet struck the wooden post above our heads. The echo rolled through the warehouse like thunder. Then came hurried footsteps. We rushed toward the rear door, but whoever had fired was already disappearing into the fog. Holmes stopped beside the open doorway. On the wet stones lay a small object, a brass button. He picked it up and examined its surface. Military? No, he said. Telegraph service. I looked back toward the warehouse. The night had begun with one impossible telegram. Now we had a dead engineer, a hidden invention, a tampered machine, a mysterious stranger, and an attempted murder. Yet Holmes remained strangely calm. I confess I was lost. The evidence pointed in multiple directions, and every answer seemed to produce another question. As dawn approached, Holmes closed his hand around the brass button. We are no longer investigating Bellamy's death, Watson. What are we investigating? He looked toward the Thames, where the first grey light was beginning to touch the water. A conspiracy that began before Bellamy died. And somewhere beyond the warehouses, hidden by the fog, a telegraph key began to tap. Chapter 3. Deeper Waters. The tapping of the telegraph key ceased almost as suddenly as it had begun. Holmes and I stood in the warehouse doorway, listening to the Thames lap against the stone embankment. The fog had thickened during our pursuit, and the cold was sharp enough to make my fingers ache. From somewhere upriver came the deep groan of a steamer, followed by the clatter of chains and the distant cry of a watchman. Holmes remained motionless. "Did you hear it, Watson?" "Yes, from the warehouse." "No, from the vessel beside it." He crossed the yard and descended toward the water. I followed, though with considerably less enthusiasm. The smell of wet rope, tar, coal smoke, and stagnant river water grew stronger as we approached a narrow barge moored beneath the warehouse wall. A lantern swung from its mast, casting trembling reflections across the black surface. A sailor appeared from below deck. "What do you want?" Holmes showed his card. "Mr. Bellamy's affairs." The sailor's expression changed. "I know nothing about Bellamy. I did not say Bellamy was aboard." The man's silence told Holmes more than his answer could have done. Holmes stepped onto the deck. "Where is the telegraph apparatus?" The sailor reached beneath his coat. I drew my revolver. "Don't," I warned. For several seconds, we stared at one another. Then the sailor slowly withdrew his hand and produced a key. "There's a cabin below." Holmes took the key. "Thank you." The cabin was scarcely large enough for two men to stand comfortably. A small telegraph instrument sat upon a wooden table, its brass fittings polished brightly despite the grime elsewhere. Beside it lay several sheets of paper, a half-empty bottle of brandy, and a black woolen glove. Holmes picked up the glove. "Interesting. What do you see?" "Nothing remarkable at first glance." He turned it inside out. A tiny smear of red appeared along the seam. "Blood?" "No." He touched it to his tongue. I stared. "Holmes? Rust?" He smiled. "The glove has been resting against iron machinery." I confess I had noticed only the stain. The distinction seemed trivial, yet Holmes treated it as though he had discovered a signature. He examined the telegraph instrument next. "This is not a standard installation." "What is different?" "The receiving mechanism has been altered. Someone has added a secondary contact." He pointed to a thin copper wire running beneath the table. "Bellamy's invention." "Then this is where the secret messages were received." "Not exactly." Holmes tapped the wooden table. "This apparatus sends as well as receives." Before I could reply, footsteps sounded above us. Holmes extinguished the lantern. We waited in darkness. The steps crossed the deck. A man's voice spoke quietly. "Is anyone there?" The sailor answered. "No." A pause, then the sound of something heavy being dropped. Holmes whispered, "Stay here." He moved toward the stairs. A moment later, there was a struggle. The sailor cried out. I rushed upward and saw Holmes grappling with the man in the grey coat. The silver-headed cane lay on the deck. The stranger struck Holmes across the shoulder and leapt toward the rail. I seized his coat, but the fabric tore in my hand. He disappeared into the fog. Holmes retrieved the torn piece. "Let him go," he said. "You allowed him to escape. I wanted this." He held up the fabric. Inside the torn cloth was a small stitched label. Bellamy and Co. Woolwich. I stared at it. His coat belonged to Bellamy. Not merely belonged to him. Holmes examined the stitching. It was made for Bellamy's laboratory staff. The sailor, still breathing heavily, pointed toward the river. "He's gone." "Yes," said Holmes, "but he has left us something better than himself." By sunrise we had returned to Baker Street. The fire had burned low, and Mrs. Hudson had left coffee and bread upon the table. The coffee was bitter and strong, while the bread had acquired the faint taste of smoke from the kitchen chimney. After the night's cold, the warmth of the room was almost luxurious. Holmes spread the evidence before him. The telegram, the brass button, the torn coat, the numbered strip from Bellamy's envelope, and a photograph we had discovered inside the barge's telegraph cabinet. It showed 6 men standing outside the Woolwich laboratory. Bellamy stood at the center. Beside him was Arthur Pembroke. The third man was the stranger with the silver-headed cane. The remaining 3 were unfamiliar. Holmes placed his finger upon the photograph. 5 suspects, he said. 5. Bellamy cannot be counted. He is dead. And Pembroke? A possible suspect. I looked at him in astonishment. "Surely you do not believe Pembroke killed Bellamy?" "I believe nothing until the evidence requires belief." Holmes studied the photograph again. "The man with the cane is Henry Vane, formerly Bellamy's assistant. This fellow is Dr. Elias Morton, a physicist. Here we have Samuel Price, the Arsenal watchman. And this is Lewis Carter, the telegraph clerk. 4 living men besides Pembroke. 4 men with access to Bellamy's work." He leaned back. "The interesting question is not who hated Bellamy. What is it? Who needed Bellamy alive long enough to complete his invention, and dead immediately afterward?" That question remained with me. Holmes then examined the numbered strip. "What does it mean?" "A code. Can you decipher it?" "I already have." He handed me a sheet of paper. The numbers represented letters. I read the translated message aloud. "Dock 12. Thursday. Bring the original plates. Trust no one." Original plates? The diagrams from Bellamy's machine. And they are missing? Holmes nodded. "I found no trace of them in his laboratory." I stared at the telegram. The dead man warned us about a second telegram. Yes. Could that second message have contained the location of the plates? Holmes smiled. "That is precisely what I intend to discover." He rose and reached for his coat. "Where are we going?" "To Bellamy's house." "But the police have already searched it." "Exactly." I confess I did not understand. Holmes saw my expression and chuckled. "Watson, Scotland Yard searches for evidence of murder. I search for evidence of what the murderer was afraid would be found." We left Baker Street shortly afterward. The morning was grey, wet and restless. Vendors shouted from the pavements, horses steamed in the cold air, and the city slowly awakened beneath a ceiling of cloud. Yet, as our cab turned toward Bellamy's neighborhood, I could not shake the feeling that the case had changed. The telegram was no longer an impossible message from a dead man. It was an instruction, and someone had killed to make certain we never learned what that instruction meant. Looking back, I now see that the clue was plain enough. We had been searching for the murderer, while Holmes had already begun searching for the thing the murderer feared most. At Bellamy's house, we found the front door unlocked, and from somewhere inside came the faint smell of burning paper. Chapter 4. Shadows and Suspicions. The smell of burning paper grew stronger as Holmes pushed open the door of Bellamy's house. A thin ribbon of smoke drifted from the study at the end of the passage, carrying with it the bitter scent of charred ink and warm leather. "Watson, stay close." We entered the study. A small fire burned in the grate, though the room itself was cold. Papers lay scattered across the desk, several chairs had been disturbed, and a brass wastebasket contained fragments of half-burned documents. Holmes crouched beside it. Someone was here very recently. I examined the floor. There are footprints. Several. He pointed toward the window. 2 people entered the room. Only one left through the front door. You mean the other escaped through the window? No. Holmes lifted a fragment of paper from the grate. The second person never left. I stared at him. Before I could ask what he meant, a noise came from the adjoining room. We hurried through the doorway. There stood Arthur Pembroke. His face went pale when he saw us. "Mr. Holmes! I came to warn you." "Of what?" "Bellamy's papers." Holmes regarded him coldly. "You seem remarkably well informed about what we are looking for." Pembroke hesitated. "I worked with him." "So you said." "I swear I had nothing to do with his death." Holmes stepped closer. "Then tell me why you are carrying Bellamy's laboratory key." Pembroke's hand went instinctively toward his pocket. He slowly withdrew a brass key. "I found it." "Where?" "In Bellamy's bedroom." Holmes took it from him. The key was cold and heavy, its surface marked with a narrow line of green oxidation. I confess that I suspected Pembroke at that moment. He had motive, access, and apparently the habit of concealing information from us. Perhaps you would have reached the same conclusion. Holmes, however, merely placed the key upon the desk. "You are not under arrest." Pembroke looked relieved. "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet." The next hour produced little comfort. Our first visitor was Inspector Lestrade. He entered with the brisk manner of a man already convinced that he understood the case. "We have identified the dead engineer's movements," he announced. "Bellamy met Henry Vane 3 nights before his death." "Where?" "Outside the Royal Arsenal." "Did Vane admit it?" "He admits the meeting, but denies any quarrel." Holmes glanced toward the burned papers. "Did you search Vane's rooms?" "Yes." "And?" "Nothing." Holmes smiled. "Then you searched poorly." Lestrade frowned. Before he could answer, another piece of information arrived. Henry Vane had disappeared. Our second suspect, Dr. Elias Morton, proved equally troublesome. We found him at his laboratory near the university, surrounded by glass tubes, copper instruments, and the sharp chemical smell of acids. He was a nervous man, with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. "Bellamy was a brilliant engineer," Morton told us. "Did you quarrel with him?" "Never." "Did he fear you?" Morton looked startled. "Why would he?" "Because his last notebook contains your initials." Morton's face changed. "I wrote those notes." "You wrote them?" "Yes." "Bellamy asked me to examine his transmission system." "And what did you discover?" Morton lowered his voice. "That the device could transmit more than messages." Holmes leaned forward. "What else?" "Signals." "What sort?" "Instructions." A silence followed. Morton looked toward the laboratory door. "Someone was using Bellamy's machine to coordinate movements." "Whose movements?" "I don't know." "Then why did you stop helping him?" Morton swallowed. "Because Bellamy discovered that the system was being used to communicate with a ship." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Which ship?" Morton shook his head. "I never learned its name." Our third stop was the telegraph office. Lewis Carter was waiting behind the counter. Holmes placed the brass button from the warehouse before him. "You recognize this?" Carter stared at it. "Yes." "Where have you seen it?" "On Bellamy's coat." "Are you certain?" "Yes." Holmes said nothing. Carter began to sweat. Finally, he admitted that he had copied several of Bellamy's telegrams. "Why?" "I was paid." "By whom?" Carter looked toward the window. "I don't know his name." "What did he look like?" "Tall, grey coat, silver-headed cane. The same man." Our fourth suspect was Samuel Price, the Arsenal watchman. We found him drinking tea in a small lodging house near Woolwich. He listened carefully to Holmes's questions before answering. Yes, Bellamy visited the arsenal after his resignation. With whom? Mr. Vane. And the packet? Price shook his head. I never saw what was inside. Holmes watched him closely. You lied to me yesterday. Price's cup stopped halfway to his mouth. I did. You said Bellamy came alone the first time. Price looked away. I was mistaken. No, you were frightened. The old man's hands trembled. Mr. Holmes, I have a wife. What did you see? Price whispered. Bellamy gave Vane the packet. Vane gave him something in return. What? A photograph. What photograph? Price stared at Holmes. A photograph of 6 men. The same photograph we had discovered aboard the barge. Our final suspect was Arthur Pembroke. When we returned to Baker Street, Holmes placed all the evidence upon the table. 5 men, 5 different stories. Vane had disappeared. Morton had knowledge of the secret transmission system. Carter had accepted money. Price had lied. Pembroke had concealed Bellamy's key. Consider the facts as we knew them. Each man had opportunity. Each had withheld something, and at least 2 had direct knowledge of the secret telegraph system. Which would you have suspected? I confess I was inclined toward Pembroke. Holmes, however, appeared interested in something entirely different. He held the photograph beneath the lamp. Watson, look at the men. I see 6. Look at their hands. I studied the image. Bellamy held a folder. Pembroke carried gloves. Vane held his silver-headed cane. Morton had one hand inside his coat. Price stood with his arms folded. Carter held nothing. Holmes tapped the photograph. There is our answer. I stared at him. What answer? He turned the photograph over. On the reverse, barely visible beneath the old glue, were 4 words. Thursday, Platform 4, Dawn. Holmes's expression hardened. Watson, we are going to the railway station. Why? Because someone has been sending messages from the dead, and someone else is waiting for the next one. He reached for his coat. Outside, the first rain of morning began tapping against the windows. The net, though I did not yet understand its shape, was beginning to close. Chapter 5. The Pursuit. We reached the railway station shortly before dawn, when London was at its coldest and quietest. A thin rain fell through the roof of the great iron terminus, and the platforms shone beneath the gas lamps like black glass. Holmes moved quickly. Platform 4. We crossed the concourse while porters shouted and luggage carts rattled over the stones. The smell of coal smoke mingled with wet wool, horse leather, and stale coffee from a nearby refreshment stall. A locomotive hissed somewhere beyond the platforms, its steam rolling through the station like white breath. I glanced at the station clock. 5 minutes to 6. Holmes, I said, what exactly are we expecting? A man. Which man? The man who believes we know less than we do. He stopped beside a newspaper kiosk. Observe the platform. I looked. A dozen passengers waited beneath umbrellas. A woman held a child by the hand. 2 soldiers spoke quietly near a pillar. A porter pushed a trolley of trunks toward the eastern exit. Then I saw him. The grey overcoat. The silver-headed cane. There. Holmes was already moving. The stranger saw us. He turned and ran. We followed. The chase carried us down the platform as the first train began to move. Steam burst from beneath the carriages, and the roar of the engine drowned every other sound. Holmes slipped between 2 luggage carts while I struggled after him. The stranger vaulted a low barrier. I nearly lost him in the smoke. Watson! Holmes's voice came from ahead. I ran toward it. The man had entered the parcels yard. He was fast, despite his limp. Holmes pursued him between stacked crates and coal wagons. I heard the sharp crack of wood beneath our boots and the metallic clang of a dropped chain. Then the stranger turned suddenly. He raised a pistol. Holmes threw himself behind a crate. The shot struck the iron coupling beside me. I confess that I have never been particularly fond of bullets passing within inches of my head. "Drop it!" I shouted. The man fired again. Holmes sprang from cover and struck his wrist with the handle of his revolver. The pistol fell. For one instant we had him. Then a locomotive whistle shrieked. A wall of steam swept across the yard. When it cleared, the stranger was gone. Holmes stood staring at the empty passage. "Impossible," I said. "No." He crouched beside the ground. "Look here." There was a dark smear upon the wet stones. Blood. The stranger had been wounded. Holmes followed the trail toward a small service gate. Beyond it, the tracks disappeared beneath the morning fog. He cannot have gone far. We continued the pursuit into the street. A cabman pointed toward the river. He hired a cab. Holmes climbed into another. "Follow that cab!" The driver cracked his whip. Our horses plunged forward. London rushed around us in a blur of wet pavement, chimneys, shop fronts and waking crowds. Rain struck my face. The cab wheels splashed through puddles, while bells rang behind us, and carts groaned beneath their loads. After nearly 10 minutes, we reached a narrow street beside the river. The first cab stood abandoned. Holmes jumped down. "Which way?" The driver pointed toward an old warehouse. He went inside. Holmes drew his revolver. We entered. The building was deserted, except for crates, ropes, and a broken handcart. A smell of damp wood and river mud hung in the air. Then we heard a groan. Behind a stack of crates lay Lewis Carter, the telegraph clerk. He was alive but badly beaten. "Carter!" Holmes knelt beside him. "Who did this?" Carter opened his eyes. "The man. The grey coat. What did he want?" "The telegram." "Which telegram?" Carter coughed. "The second one." Holmes looked at me. "What did it say?" Carter's lips trembled. "I never read it." "Where is it?" Carter pointed weakly toward a wooden crate. Holmes opened it. Inside was a metal telegraph cylinder. He examined it carefully. "This is not a message." "What is it?" "A recording device." Carter shook his head. "Bellamy built it." Holmes studied the cylinder. "Watson, remember what Morton told us. Bellamy's system could transmit signals as well as messages." He opened the device. Inside was a thin strip of paper covered with numbers. Holmes read them. Then his expression changed. "Good heavens! What?" He passed me the strip. I could make nothing of it. Holmes translated the numbers quickly. The message read, "The second telegram will reveal the traitor." Beneath it was another line, "Trust the man who was declared dead." I looked at Holmes. "But Bellamy is dead." "Yes." He stood. "And that is why the message is so clever." We returned to the warehouse entrance. Holmes examined the muddy floor. There were footprints leading toward the river. Then he noticed something else. A small piece of blue cloth lay beside the doorway. He picked it up. "Railway uniform?" "No." He rubbed the fabric between his fingers. "Telegraph service." I remembered Carter. Then the stranger was working with someone at the station, or pretending to. Holmes folded the cloth. "Our enemy wants us to suspect Carter." But Carter was attacked. "Exactly." He looked toward the river. "Someone is manufacturing evidence faster than we can collect it." A sound came from outside. A carriage. Holmes rushed to the doorway. Across the street stood Arthur Pembroke. He was watching us. When he saw Holmes, he turned and hurried away. "Pembroke!" We ran after him. He disappeared into a crowded market near the river, where fishmongers shouted over one another and carts blocked the narrow lanes. The air was thick with the smell of fish, salt, wet rope, and coal smoke. Holmes stopped. "He is gone. You think he is the traitor? I think he wants us to believe he is." I stared at him. "You are making this very difficult." Holmes smiled. "Only because the truth is inconvenient." He opened his hand. The brass button from the warehouse lay in his palm. "Look at the scratches." I examined it. "What am I looking for?" "Not the scratches, the absence of them." He pointed to the edge. This button was recently removed from a uniform. What uniform? Holmes's eyes gleamed. A railway uniform. For the first time, I understood why the stranger had fled toward the station. He had not been trying merely to escape us. He had been trying to reach someone. Holmes turned toward the railway line. "We are close, Watson. To the murderer? To the purpose behind the murder." He began walking. I followed. Yet the words of the telegram remained in my mind. Trust the man who was declared dead. At the time, I believed Bellamy's death was the foundation of the mystery. I was wrong. It was the greatest deception in the entire affair. Holmes seemed to understand this already. But he would not explain, not yet. And as the rain began to fall harder upon the river, a messenger arrived at the warehouse, carrying one final telegram. It was addressed to Sherlock Holmes. The sender was Edward Bellamy. The message contained only 4 words. "I know who killed me." Chapter 6. The Past Speaks. The telegram arrived while the rain beat against the warehouse windows. Holmes held the paper beneath the weak light of a gas lamp and read it twice. The paper smelled faintly of damp wool and machine oil, and a drop of river water had blurred one corner of the message. "I know who killed me." Below it was Edward Bellamy's name. I confess that for several seconds I could think of nothing to say. "Holmes," I whispered, "this is impossible." "Not impossible, Watson." "You have just received a telegram from a dead man." "Yes." He folded the message carefully. "That is considerably more interesting than impossible." We returned to Baker Street before continuing the investigation. The fire was burning warmly when we arrived, and Mrs. Hudson had prepared tea. The contrast between the dry room and the cold streets outside was welcome, though neither the tea nor the thick slice of bread placed before me could remove the uneasiness that had settled over my mind. Holmes spread Bellamy's papers across the table. "We have made one assumption from the beginning," he said. "That Bellamy was murdered." "Correct. Was he not?" "I said we made the assumption. I did not say it was wrong." He pointed to the first telegram. Bellamy's message announced his own death. The second warned us of another telegram. The third now claims to know his murderer, and yet Bellamy died 3 days ago. Holmes nodded. "Unless the telegrams were prepared before his death." I stared at him. "Then someone has been sending them afterward." "Precisely. Who?" "That is what the next few hours must tell us." Holmes returned to the photograph of the 6 men. Bellamy's work began innocently enough. He wanted to increase the speed and secrecy of telegraphic communication, but the military applications became obvious. He pointed toward Henry Vane. Vane was his assistant. He understood the mechanical construction. Then Dr. Morton. Morton understood the scientific principle. Lewis Carter. Carter controlled access to the telegraph network. Samuel Price. Price had access to the arsenal. Finally, Pembroke. And Pembroke had Bellamy's complete confidence, which makes him the most dangerous. Holmes shook his head. Or the most convenient suspect. He opened a small notebook. Bellamy discovered that his invention was being used to send coded instructions between London and a vessel on the Thames. He confronted one of his associates. Vane? Possibly. And then? 3 days later, Bellamy was dead. I leaned back. Then the motive was espionage. Not necessarily. Holmes looked toward the fire. Money is often more powerful than politics. He explained that Bellamy's invention could allow merchants, gamblers, smugglers, and foreign agents to exchange information without ordinary telegraph operators knowing what was being transmitted. A secret communication system could therefore become a fortune, and Bellamy wanted to stop them. He wanted control of his invention. That distinction proved important. Holmes then produced the brass button. You remember this, the railway button. Yes. He turned it over. Look carefully. Beneath the scratches was a tiny engraved number. 14. Exactly. What does it mean? Not a uniform number, a workshop number. He crossed to the bookshelf and removed a directory. After several minutes, he found the reference. Bellamy's laboratory maintained 14 numbered instruments. Then the button belonged to one of them. Not quite. Holmes smiled. It belonged to a man who worked on instrument 14. He wrote the name on a sheet of paper. Henry Vane. I stared at it. So Vane was the man in the grey coat. Almost certainly. But why the cane? Because the limp is genuine. Holmes explained that Vane had injured his leg in an arsenal accident years earlier. The cane therefore served two purposes. It supported him and concealed his identity. I confess I felt a rush of satisfaction at this discovery. Then we have him. Perhaps. Holmes's expression remained thoughtful. Consider something else. Vane knew Bellamy's machine. He could have murdered him, but why would he send us these telegrams? To frighten us? No. To mislead us? Possibly. Holmes leaned back. Or to lead us toward the truth. This possibility unsettled me more than any accusation. Later that afternoon, we visited the medical examiner who had certified Bellamy's death. The doctor, a tired man with silver spectacles, received us in a room that smelled of disinfectant, alcohol, and cold stone. Mr. Bellamy died from cardiac failure, he told us. Was there evidence of violence? No. Poison? None detected. Holmes looked at me. An apparently natural death. Could he have been murdered? The doctor hesitated. Possibly. But there was nothing obvious. Holmes examined the original medical report. Then he stopped. Doctor, what is this? The report contained a small notation beside Bellamy's time of death. 11:40 p.m. Holmes looked up. You recorded his death at 11:40. Yes. Who was present? The housekeeper. Anyone else? No. Holmes folded the report. What time did the housekeeper summon you? Midnight. Then Bellamy had been dead for 20 minutes before anyone entered the room. Holmes thanked him. Outside, the evening air was bitterly cold. Gas lamps were beginning to glow along the street, and the smell of coal smoke drifted between the houses. You have discovered something, I said. Yes. What? Holmes stopped beneath a lamp. Bellamy did not send his first telegram after he died. Then he sent it before. Correct. But the message said, I am dead. Holmes nodded, which means Bellamy expected to die. The thought struck me with considerable force. He knew someone intended to kill him. Exactly. Then why did he not go to the police? Because he did not trust them. Holmes removed Bellamy's black envelope. Inside, beneath the numbered strip, we discovered a final piece of paper. It contained only one sentence. The man who knows the truth will be declared dead before he speaks. I read it twice. Holmes was silent. Then he said, Watson, we have been looking for a murderer. Yes. We should instead have been looking for a man who is supposed to be dead. The answer seemed absurd. Yet I remembered the stranger's coat, the secret telegraph, the photograph, and the messages from Bellamy. Suddenly, the entire case seemed to shift beneath our feet. The signs had been there from the beginning. I had simply accepted the most obvious version of events. Holmes walked to the window. Tomorrow morning, Watson, we visit the cemetery. Bellamy's grave. No. He turned. Henry Vane's. I stared at him. Vane is alive. Holmes smiled grimly. According to Scotland Yard, and for the first time, I understood that the dead man in our mystery might not be Edward Bellamy at all. Chapter 7. The Truth Emerges. We reached the cemetery shortly after sunrise. The fog lay low over the stones, and the bare branches of the trees rattled in the cold wind. Holmes walked directly toward a narrow grave near the eastern wall. The name upon the stone was Henry Vane. I stared at it. Vane died 2 years ago. So the records say. Holmes knelt beside the grave. The earth was undisturbed. He smiled. This grave contains someone, but not Henry Vane. Before I could answer, a voice came from behind us. "You should have stopped looking, Mr. Holmes." We turned. The man in the grey coat stood between the tombstones, his silver-headed cane in one hand and a revolver in the other. Holmes remained perfectly calm. "Henry Vane." The man smiled bitterly. "Bellamy was clever, but you are worse. Where is Bellamy? Dead. Of course. But you know that already." Vane's expression hardened. "You don't understand." "I understand everything." Holmes stepped forward. "Bellamy discovered that you had been selling his invention. You arranged his death to appear natural. You then continued sending telegrams in his name, hoping to frighten anyone who came too close." Vane shook his head. "No. You sent Pembroke to Baker Street." "No. You attacked Carter." "No." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "You did none of those things." For the first time, Vane looked frightened. Holmes continued. "The murderer was someone you trusted. A figure emerged from behind the cemetery wall. Arthur Pembroke. He carried a pistol." Vane turned. "You!" Pembroke fired. Vane collapsed against a stone monument. I rushed toward him, but Holmes seized my arm. "Wait." Pembroke lowered the pistol. "It is finished." Holmes looked at him. "Yes, it is." Pembroke's face was pale. "Bellamy knew everything. He discovered I had sold the plans to foreign agents. He intended to expose me. And so you killed him." Pembroke nodded. "But Vane helped you." "No. Vane discovered what I had done and tried to stop me." Holmes looked toward the grave. "Then whose body is buried here?" Pembroke closed his eyes. "An unknown man." Holmes nodded. "Exactly as I suspected. I confess that the full truth struck me with overwhelming force. Bellamy had prepared the first telegram before his death. Vane had continued the deception to expose Pembroke, and Pembroke had tried to destroy every witness." Holmes turned to the wounded Vane. "You sent the second telegram." Vane nodded weakly. "I knew Bellamy had left instructions." "And the third?" Vane smiled. "I wanted you to understand." Holmes glanced at me. "The game is afoot." Police whistles sounded beyond the cemetery gates. Lestrade and 2 constables entered. Pembroke did not resist. Holmes picked up the fallen pistol. "The murderer has been found." I looked once more at Bellamy's mysterious telegram. The dead man had indeed sent a message, but it was not the dead who had spoken. It was the truth, waiting for someone clever enough to hear it. Chapter 8. Justice. The arrival of Inspector Lestrade brought an end to the strange silence that had followed Pembroke's confession. 2 constables took him into custody, while another examined Henry Vane, who, though wounded, remained conscious. The cemetery had become strangely ordinary again. Birds called among the bare branches, carts rattled beyond the iron gates, and the damp smell of earth mingled with the smoke of London's chimneys. Lestrade turned toward Holmes. "You knew Pembroke was the man." "I suspected him." "Then why allow all this?" "Because suspicion is not proof." Holmes pointed toward the grave. "Pembroke believed Vane was dead. Vane allowed him to believe it. Bellamy prepared the telegrams before his death. Together, those facts created the deception." Lestrade frowned. "And the body? An unidentified man who died 2 years ago. Vane arranged for his name to be placed upon the grave after discovering that Pembroke intended to have him killed." Vane spoke weakly. "Pembroke believed I had disappeared abroad. I wanted him to think I was dead." "And Bellamy?" I asked. Vane lowered his eyes. "Bellamy discovered Pembroke's dealings with foreign agents. He knew he would be killed, so he prepared the first telegram." Holmes nodded. "He also prepared the second." Vane smiled faintly. "Yes." "Why send it after his death?" "Because Bellamy knew Holmes would investigate." I looked at Holmes. "So Bellamy expected you?" "Not me," said Holmes. He expected someone who would notice the contradiction. The contradiction was simple. A dead man could not send a telegram. Therefore, whoever appeared to be speaking afterward had to be following instructions Bellamy had prepared in advance. Holmes had followed the physical evidence rather than the apparent impossibility. I confess that nothing in my experience had prepared me for the peculiar manner in which justice had finally arrived. There had been no dramatic confession in a drawing room, no elaborate trap beneath a chandelier. Instead, the truth had emerged from telegrams, railway dust, a grave, and the stubborn persistence of a dying man's final plan. Pembroke was taken away. Before leaving, he turned toward Vane. "You betrayed me." Vane answered quietly, "No, I betrayed a murderer." Pembroke said nothing more. At the station, Scotland Yard later recovered the documents, proving that Pembroke had sold Bellamy's designs. The evidence included coded correspondence, payment records, and copies of the secret transmission plans. Carter was released after confirming the messages he had copied. Price was warned but not charged. Morton, whose knowledge of the invention had initially made him suspicious, was cleared completely, and Henry Vane, though still under investigation for concealing evidence, became the principal witness against Pembroke. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street that evening. The rain had stopped. London was quiet beneath a pale moon, and the familiar warmth of our sitting room seemed almost unreal after the cold cemetery. Holmes placed Bellamy's final telegram upon the mantel. "You see, Watson," he said, "a clever criminal fears evidence. A clever victim leaves evidence behind." I looked at the telegram. Bellamy's final plan saved the case. "No," said Holmes. He picked up his violin. "Bellamy's final plan merely gave us a direction." "And what solved it?" Holmes smiled. "Observation." He raised the bow. A soft note filled the room. Outside, the city continued its endless movement, unaware that one of its darker secrets had finally been exposed. For the first time in days, I felt the tension leave me. The dead had spoken. The murderer had been arrested. And the strange telegram that had begun our adventure had finally delivered its message. Chapter 9. Restoration. The weeks that followed brought the affair gradually before the courts, where the strange circumstances surrounding Edward Bellamy's death were examined with considerably less mystery than they had possessed in Baker Street. Arthur Pembroke was charged with murder, conspiracy, and the theft of Bellamy's telegraphic designs. The documents recovered by Scotland Yard proved decisive. His correspondence with foreign agents, together with records of payments, established that he had intended to sell Bellamy's invention for a considerable sum. The newspapers seized upon the story. For several days, London was filled with accounts of the dead engineer's telegram, though most of them contained more invention than fact. I was amused to find that one paper described Holmes as having pursued the murderer across the roofs of London, which was entirely untrue. Holmes merely remarked that newspapers possessed their own methods of deduction. Henry Vane recovered from his wound and appeared in court as a principal witness. His testimony explained why he had allowed the world to believe him dead and why he had continued Bellamy's deception after the engineer's death. He admitted that his methods had been dangerous. "I wanted Pembroke to reveal himself," he said. The judge was not entirely impressed. Nevertheless, Vane's evidence helped establish the truth. The innocent men were gradually cleared. Lewis Carter admitted accepting money to copy telegrams, but he had never understood their purpose. Samuel Price confessed that fear had caused him to conceal what he knew. Dr. Elias Morton, whose scientific knowledge had initially made him appear suspicious, was completely exonerated. I confess that I felt some satisfaction when Morton's name was cleared. Throughout the affair, he had appeared guilty merely because he knew too much, and it reminded me how easily suspicion can attach itself to an innocent man when facts are incomplete. Bellamy's laboratory was eventually closed. His invention was placed under government supervision, and the secret transmission apparatus was removed from the telegraph network. The authorities considered the device too dangerous to remain in private hands. One evening, Holmes and I visited Bellamy's grave. The cemetery was quiet beneath a pale winter sky. The stone was cold beneath my fingers, and the air carried the faint smell of damp leaves and distant coal smoke. "He accomplished what he intended," I said. Holmes stood with his hands behind his back. Yes, he knew he was going to die. Yes, and still managed to expose his murderer. Holmes looked toward the grave. Bellamy understood something important. What? That information survives its owner. I considered this. Then, the telegram was his final weapon. Holmes smiled, a rather ingenious one. We stood silently for a while. The case had begun with an impossible message and ended with an ordinary grave. Yet the mystery had changed more than the fate of those involved. Pembroke had lost his freedom. Vane had regained his name, and Bellamy's work had been rescued from those who would have turned it into a weapon. As we walked back toward the city, I realized that the strange tension which had followed us for so many nights had finally disappeared. The mystery was solved. Justice had been done, and London, indifferent as ever, had already begun to forget. Looking back, I think that was what Holmes valued most. Not fame, not the newspaper accounts, and certainly not the praise of Scotland Yard. He wanted only the truth restored to its proper place. By the time we reached Baker Street, the case was closed. The telegram had been answered, and the dead man could finally remain silent. Chapter 10. Baker Street Reflections. A week after the conclusion of the Bellamy affair, Baker Street had returned to its familiar quiet. The fog still gathered beyond the windows, cabs still rattled over the wet pavement, and the fire in our sitting room still cast its comfortable glow upon Holmes's scattered books and papers. Holmes sat in his chair, reading the morning newspaper. I had just finished my breakfast when he folded it neatly. "Nothing more about Bellamy," I observed. "Excellent. You dislike newspapers?" "I dislike newspapers when they believe themselves detectives." I laughed. For several minutes neither of us spoke. The kettle whispered upon the grate, and the familiar smell of tobacco lingered in the warm room. After the cold streets and dark warehouses of the previous weeks, the ordinary peace of Baker Street seemed especially pleasant. "You have not played your violin," I remarked. Holmes glanced toward the instrument. The case required concentration. "And now it requires reflection." He rose and walked toward the window. "You know, Watson, the most interesting part of the affair was never the murder." I looked at him. "What then? The telegram? Because it came from a dead man?" "No, because it appeared to." Holmes explained that Bellamy had understood the weakness of his enemies. They expected the dead to remain silent. By preparing his messages in advance, he turned that expectation against them. His greatest protection, Holmes said, was not the invention itself. It was his understanding of human assumptions. I considered this, yet Pembroke nearly succeeded. Yes. Why? Because Pembroke understood greed better than he understood fear. Holmes returned to his chair. He believed Bellamy's death would end the matter. He did not anticipate that Bellamy had prepared for death. The room fell quiet. I confess that when I first encountered the telegram, I thought the mystery lay in the impossible. A dead man could not send a message, and therefore the message seemed supernatural. But Holmes had never accepted that explanation. He had examined the paper, the timing, the machinery, the people connected with Bellamy, and finally, the contradiction itself. The impossible had not been the clue. It had been the disguise. You know, I said. "I believe Bellamy would have liked you." Holmes smiled. "Perhaps. You saved his reputation." "No, Watson. He saved his own." The fire cracked. Outside, a distant church bell announced the hour. Holmes reached for his violin. "Another curious case will arrive soon." "I hope it waits until after lunch," he laughed. "Your priorities remain admirable." He began to play. The first notes were soft and melancholy, filling the room with a sound utterly unlike the clatter of London beyond our windows. I sat quietly and watched the morning light spread across the carpet. The case of Edward Bellamy had begun with a telegram from a dead man and ended with the quiet restoration of truth. There had been frightened witnesses, hidden documents, secret signals, false identities, and a murderer who believed that death could silence his victim. He had been wrong. As I write these final lines, I find myself thinking of those who followed this account, from that first mysterious message to the final arrest. Perhaps the reader, like myself, suspected the wrong man more than once. I certainly did. But that is the peculiar fascination of Holmes's method. The answer rarely announces itself. It waits patiently in some small detail, a mark upon a button, a delay in a telegram, a footprint in wet mud, a phrase whose meaning has not yet been understood. Holmes once told me that facts do not cease to be facts merely because we fail to recognize their importance. I have remembered that lesson ever since. The fire burned lower. Holmes continued playing. Outside, London disappeared beneath the evening fog, and the lamps along Baker Street began to glow one by one. For once, there was no murderer to pursue, no telegram to decipher, and no shadow waiting beyond our door. The case was closed. I put down my pen, and Sherlock Holmes played on.